Hello my friends and welcome back to another Baldur's Gate 3 tier list and guide. Hope you're all doing well. Today we're continuing my updated ultimate guide to spells with the level 4 spells, which are not as massive a power spike as level 3 for most classes, though one class is an exception, but nevertheless give you some incredibly powerful tools. Level 4 is actually where I think some of the most fun spells are as a result of that. It's very easy to use the straightforwardly awesome level 3 spells to gain huge advantages, but level 4 tends to be more nuanced and subtle, so it's where you can really differentiate between being good at the game and being truly great at the game. I've already gone over the rating system and the definitions of the tiers when talking about the level 1 spells and cantrips, so we're just going to get right into it. But of course, before I do want to take a quick moment to say thank you so much to Mira Fiore for the 100 Zlotys donation, Tarantula for the $5, Tucky for the $5, and Aspen Abbott and CB for becoming channel members. Thank you so much, my friends. I really appreciate the support. Alright, let's talk level 4 spells. We're going to start with one of my personal favorite spells, Banishment. Banishment is a single target control spell. So you cast it on an enemy and they have to make a charisma saving throw, which if they fail, they are banished from the entire game for 2 turns. They're fully removed from the game, so they can't take damage, be hit by other spell effects, or do anything. They aren't able to move, react, or provide any help to their allies in combat. So a banished enemy basically ceases to exist for 2 turns after they fail the 1 charisma saving throw. When they come back, they will then skip their turn, so you'll always get at least 1 full round of attacks against a banished enemy before they get to take an action again, because when they come back, they don't take their turn immediately. So banishment not only removes them from combat for 2 turns, it also means that you have effectively stunned them for 1 turn and can still take a full round of attacks against them. The downside of this spell, of course, is that it is a single target concentration disable, and those are available at much lower levels. And you can't damage the enemy while they're banished, so compared to something like Hold Person will lock down an enemy completely and you'll still be able to hit them and do even more damage than normal, whereas a banished enemy you can't interact with. The upside of Banishment is that it will effectively let you get free rounds of spell casting against an enemy. If you banish an enemy, they're removed from the fight for 2 turns. You can use that time to put down, say, a Spike Growth and a Fog Cloud on their location, and then when they come back, you've basically gotten to cast those 2 spells for free. You can set up things like Glyphs of Warding, which they will trigger as soon as they return into the banishment location. You can throw a pot of fire on the ground or set up an ice surface. So there's lots of ways that you can set up traps in order to kill a banished enemy with very, very little trouble when they return. Removing them from the fight gives you a lot of options to make their lives incredibly difficult when they come back, and then you also get a full round of attacks against them. By itself, this wouldn't be enough to make this spell particularly worthwhile compared to other single-target disables like Tasha's or Hold Person, but the other important thing about Banishment is that it targets a charisma save. There are very few spells in the game that target an enemy's charisma saving throw, and a lot of enemies have truly terrible charisma saves. Some enemies will have very good wisdom saves, and so trying to land Hold Person on them, you might have a 50% chance and a 95% chance of landing Banishment on them with the same character. So because there are such enormous differences between enemy saving throws when it comes to their charisma, and even some very, very dangerous late-game bosses have truly terrible charisma saves, so you can land this spell extremely reliably, this will often be less powerful crowd control than other options, but vastly more reliable, and it's usually good enough to win the fight anyways. For examples of this spell in play, you should check out my video, The 5 Most Underrated Spells in Baldur's Gate 3. I have a whole section on Banishment there, because this spell I think is often ignored by players, but the fact that it is so much more reliable in certain encounters means that it's definitely one that you should have in your back pocket in any given party. That was a difficult sentence to say for some reason, because working against certain enemies so incredibly reliably makes this spell very good. You can also upcast Banishment to hit multiple targets, which of course is very powerful in a fight where there's multiple dangerous enemies with low charisma saves. Unfortunately, unlike in tabletop Dungeons & Dragons, you can't use this spell to permanently banish a demon or other creature that's not native to the material plane. It would be kind of cool if you could do that in Baldur's Gate, but you'll still just win most fights where you land this on an important target. I'm going to give Banishment B tier because it's not useful in every encounter. There's plenty of encounters where targeting charisma is irrelevant, but in the fights where it is good, it's by far the best tool for the job. Blight. Blight is a single target damage spell. It does 8d8 necrotic damage for 36 average damage with a constitution saving throw for half. It's also only 30-foot range, so it's shorter ranged than most single target damage spells, which is obviously going to be a significant hindrance in a lot of encounters where you want longer range on your damaging effects. A single target damage spell is always going to have an uphill climb, and 36 average damage is not enough damage to make me usually want to cast this spell. 36 damage for a 4th level spell slot is usually less than a fighter is going to do by just attacking twice at this level, so spending a very important resource on single target damage, something that your martial characters handle much better, is always going to be difficult to do, and this just doesn't do enough damage to justify it in most cases. That's also assuming that enemies don't make the Constitution saving throw, which they usually will, because Constitution saving throws on enemies tend to be very high. It's the worst save to target, and also something like half of all enemies in Baldur's Gate 3 are resistant or immune to necrotic damage, so it's by far the worst damage type for most characters. Blight does have one additional modifier, which is that when cast against a plant, it always does maximum damage. So instead of doing 8d8, it just does 64 necrotic damage. But there's very few plants in Baldur's Gate 3, and by the time you get this spell, you're going to be in Act 2, where the only plants have resistance to necrotic damage, making casting Blight against them incredibly terrible. The only exception to this rule is a Death Domain Cleric, because Death Domain Clerics ignore resistance to necrotic damage, and get Blight as a domain spell, so they don't need to actually spend a spell prepared slot on learning this. They can use Blight against the plants in Act 2 for a reasonable value, because 64 guaranteed damage, even with a con save for half, is still pretty good. So when you ignore the damage resistance that every other character has when casting Blight against the plants, Death Domain Clerics can get some decent value out of it. The other use case for Blight is with the Staff of Cherished Necromancy, which is an item that lets you cast necromancy spells for free once every time you kill an enemy. So if you can chain blights from enemy to enemy in order to kill them and aren't spending spell slots on the Staff of Cherished Necromancy, then Blight has a little bit more value. But even for those characters, Blight is still usually not going to be very good because Inflict Wounds exists. Inflict Wounds upcast to level 4 is 33 average damage, so only 3 less than Blight, but without a Constitution save for half, so it's going to be much more effective than casting Blight a lot of the time. And it's an attack roll, so it can also critically hit. So usually, unless you desperately need the 30-foot range, just upcasting Inflict Wounds is going to be better. With the Staff of Cherished Necromancy, you're also going to be using 6th level spell slots on these almost always, and their Inflict Wounds does 44 average damage, Blight does 45, so Inflict Wounds is just more average damage when you take into account the fact that it can critically hit, even if you ignore enemy saving throws completely, but also Blight has the chance of enemies making the save and taking half damage. So for Death Domain Clerics against the plants in Act 2, Blight can be okay. And if you desperately need the 30-foot range on a Staff of Cherished Necromancy build, Blight can be okay. So I guess I'll give it a very begrudging C tier, but with the caveat that you should almost never cast this spell. Next up, Confusion, which is, fittingly, an extremely confusing spell. This is another one where the game makes very little attempt to actually tell the player how the spell in fact works. The tooltip says, befuddle a group of creatures, causing them to attack at random, wander around aimlessly, and occasionally skip turns in their stupor. But it doesn't tell you how it decides whether they do any of that or what those effects actually mean. Firstly, Confusion does not target creatures, it only targets enemies, which is a very important distinction. It's a 20-foot radius concentration control spell, so it fills a similar role as something like Hypnotic Pattern, slightly lower radius, but importantly only targets enemies instead of targeting every creature in the area of effect. Creatures within the area have to make a wisdom saving throw, or they get the confusion debuff for 3 turns. Here's how confusion actually works. Each turn, the creature has a 50% chance of falling into a stupor, which is basically a stun, and a 50% chance of using the Madness AI archetype to take their turn for that turn. I talked a little bit about this one already when talking about Crown of Madness, but basically how it works is everything treats them as hostile, and they treat everything else as hostile. They no longer prioritize not damaging themselves with area of effect attacks, and they no longer prioritize the normal targeting priorities that enemies in Baldur's Gate have, like breaking concentration, attacking low health characters, and things like that. So for melee enemies, they're usually going to just attack the nearest thing to them, although sometimes they will run past a bunch of creatures to still attack your whole party. And for any character with an AoE attack, they're usually going to use that AoE attack in order to hit themselves and basically everything else in the encounter. So when an enemy goes mad, it can be very useful if they have bombs or things like that, because they'll blow up themselves and a bunch of their allies. Similar to Crown of Madness, this is obviously extremely powerful, but inherently somewhat unreliable control. Sometimes an enemy who fails their save against confusion is just going to be stunned for 3 turns, which is obviously amazing. Sometimes they'll act, but their actions will be good for you, because they're going to blow up a bunch of their allies or turn on each other, and that's even better. But sometimes they're just going to act in a way that's still very bad for you. You're going to pass your turn, and the confused enemy is just going to run straight to your caster and beat them with a big stick regardless, which is what they were going to do with their turn anyways, and then you're very sad that you wasted your time on this spell. So it's very powerful, but you have to make sure that you have arranged the encounter to get the maximum usage out of this effect, and you won't be able to use it in every encounter. There's 2 times where confusion is a better choice than a lower level concentration spell like Hypnotic Pattern or Fear, which are more reliable and take a lower level spell slot, so are often going to be the choice. The first situation is where your party and the enemies are all mixed up together, and you still want to land an AoE control spell on them. Then you can use confusion because it doesn't hit your allies. So in place of something like Hypnotic Pattern, it's going to be more powerful. A lot of time in that situation, you would still prefer to just upcast Command or Hold Person as a control spell, or use Slow, which works when the fight is very confused and doesn't have the unreliability of Confusion, but Confusion is a more powerful debuff, so that can be pretty good. The other case where Confusion is good is if you can just leave. If you hit a bunch of enemies with confusion and then shut the door, you can just wait while they all blow each other up, and since the entire encounter is confused, yeah, some of them will pass their turns, but a lot of times they will just attack one another for 3 turns, and against a lot of encounters, that can just win the encounter outright. Most of the time, confusion is going to be a secondary choice after a more reliable spell like Fear or Hypnotic Pattern, or a more reliable spell like Slow if you and the enemies are very mixed up together, but it's still an extremely powerful effect. So when you can arrange for this spell to be good, it's very good. I'm going to give it B tier, because it does require some specific circumstances to be better than the alternatives, but those circumstances do definitely exist. Conjure Minor Elemental. Conjure Minor Elemental is a summon spell, so it lasts the entire day, or as long as you can keep the summons alive, and it has 3 possible modes for what type of summon you're going to create. You can either create 2 Mud Mephits, 2 Ice Mephits, or 1 Aether. The Mud Mephits are usually the weakest of these options. They do decent melee damage, have a pretty bad ranged attack, and have an AoE Restrain, which isn't bad, but the save DC on it is pretty low, and the Mud Mephits have to get close. They also have the least hit points and lowest AC of any of the 3 options, so they're usually going to die pretty quickly. They do have their uses in some circumstances, but usually you're going to be looking at the other 2 possibilities when using Conjure Minor Elemental. The Aether is a single summon, which obviously is half as many actions as the possibilities that give you 2 summons. So, but it has 39 hit points and 20 armor class, so it's actually pretty tough. With 20 AC, a lot of enemies will miss it. If you extend its hit points with something like Aid, or give it damage reduction with, like the buff on heal items to give it Blade Ward and stuff like that, 40 hit points with 20 AC will stay alive a decent amount of the time. It does pretty solid melee damage, and also as a bonus action can try to light everything nearby it on fire, so it does fairly reasonable AoE damage, but mostly the Azer is there for tanking. If you have other ways to increase its defensive capabilities, then it will stay alive against a lot of enemies pretty well. The Ice Mephits are usually the one that you're going to go with, though. The Ice Mephits are 2 flying allies that have great melee damage, which is cold damage, so you can double it using the wet condition, and a great ranged attack because they just cast the cold version of Chromatic Orb, so they do excellent cold damage at range and then also create an ice surface every single time they attack, so having the Ice Mephits just makes 2 ice surfaces every single turn. They also can use a cone-based AoE damage spell. That won't come up that often, but if both of them use their exhale for cold damage on top of a wet enemy, or a group of wet enemies, that can actually end up being pretty significant amounts of damage. Both types of Mephit also explode on their death, for 2d6 force or cold damage respectively, and you can manually trigger this explosion to double the damage output, to 4d6 cold or force damage. If you manually explode both Ice Mephits, that's a total of 8d6 cold damage, so basically a cold fireball, which you can then double using the wet condition, so that can actually be a huge burst of damage output if you want to sacrifice your summons in order to just do a giant AoE explosion. That's a very powerful tool, so as long as you keep these creatures alive, they're going to do constant damage over time, add a bunch of crowd control on the field, and then you can sacrifice them to blow up one encounter once per day. So they give you a ton of utility, and that's why usually you're going to summon the Ice Mephits. They just have way more possibilities for use than the other 2 types of summons. Conjure Minor Elemental, like every other summon spell, is just very powerful. Having more actions on the field, having more targets on the field, and having more bodies on the field gives you more tactical options, more damage. It's a way to convert a spell slot into a buff that just helps your entire party throughout the entire day, so it's going to be relevant in every encounter that you engage in. So just a very powerful tool overall, and the fact that the Ice Mephits do excellent damage and provide tons of free crowd control while also being flying, so it is hard for enemies to target them, even though they're relatively squishy, is very powerful as well. One other fun fact about Conjure Minor Elemental is if you recast it when you have the Mephits summoned, they will trigger the death explosions, so you can resummon them if they're at low health and then get the burst damage. It won't be the doubled version from manually triggering it, but if you if you know you want to resummon some low health summons for whatever reason, that's something you can do. It's a very, very minor trick that doesn't really affect the rating of the spell. Also, just a couple fun pieces of trivia about this spell. Mephit is a made-up word, but does come from a real word, mephitic, meaning poisonous or noxious. And I mentioned last time that I was trying to look up how you pronounce Azer and couldn't find a pronunciation guide online, but instead found thousands of comments from people who were incredibly horny for the Azer summon. Someone has actually added a pronunciation guide to the Forgotten Realms wiki, but don't worry, people are still extremely thirsty for this summoned creature. So if you were worried that the Baldur's Gate community had gotten less charged in the last year, you definitely have not. I'm going to give Conjure Minor Elemental A tier. It's a very, very powerful tool for your party. Just a really nice benefit for a 4th level spell that lasts for as long as you can keep the summons alive. They will be giving you consistent high value. Conjure Woodland Being. Conjure Woodland Being is a druid summon spell, and this spell alone is a huge part of why druids hit such an enormous power spike at level 7, unlike most other spellcasters, because getting access to this spell powers up your party enormously. When you use Conjure Woodland Being, you get a Dryad who fights with you all day, and the Dryad has a bunch of abilities, so this ends up being several spells all wrapped up into one. Firstly, she passively makes your entire party, or everyone within a radius of her, immune to difficult terrain, immune to paralysis and restrained, and have resistance to poison damage. That alone is already really good. It turns off some of the most dangerous effects in the game, makes poison damage much less of a factor, which there are some fights where you're going to take a lot of poison damage. So the Dryad just having that as a passive ability is excellent. She can also cast Entangle at will and Spike Growth at will, 2 excellent control spells. Just having an extra copy of Spike Growth in every encounter is incredibly powerful and lets you gain so much more control over the battlefield. In addition to that, once per short rest, the Dryad can summon a Woodland, which is a regenerating tank. It gains 10 hit points every turn if it's in a vine surface. That has decent hit points and resistance to piercing and bludgeoning damage. So it's going to take some enemies a long time to kill it, and you can resummon it every short rest if it dies. It too can also cast Entangle at will. On top of all these abilities, both of these summons have decent melee damage. They will hit reasonably accurately and for reasonable damage. You're not really conjuring Woodland Being for their just sheer damage output. It's more so that the Woodland can tank and both of them can just spam control spells every single turn because they don't use a cooldown or a spell slot on them. But the fact that they can wade into melee and hit things is also pretty relevant. You get so many spells every single turn that you have this active, alongside a pretty powerful regenerating tank, that Conjure Woodland Being, it's basically just like having a whole extra party member. It's that good, and it only costs you a 4th level spell slot. It's very easy to see why this is an S tier spell, but honestly, I've been playing this game for more than 2 years, and I still keep finding new things that this spell does and new uses for it. Just does so many absurd things with a single spell slot. Any party with a druid should be casting this every single day, and it's a big part of why druid is such a powerful class, is access to this spell, which is just an absurd spell. Next up, Death Ward. Death Ward is a long rest, non-concentration buff spell, where the next time a creature would take enough damage that they would drop to 0 hit points and thus go unconscious, instead they stay at 1 hit point and don't go unconscious. So basically it prevents the next time you would take lethal damage. Obviously, that's reasonably powerful, because not going down to 0 hit points is the core goal of playing Baldur's Gate 3. Everything else is in service of keeping your characters alive. So Death Ward does contribute to that goal, but it does so in a purely defensive and reactive way, where only when you're about to take lethal damage does the Death Ward actually do anything, and it costs you a 4th level spell slot, which you could use on just killing the enemies who were going to do that damage in the first place. The other problem with Death Ward, other than just being a very expensive, extremely situational, and purely defensive spell, is that it often doesn't work. When a character takes damage that is dealt in multiple instances, say a weapon that has bludgeoning and fire damage, or a magic missile that hits you with multiple damage instances, the Death Ward will only block the first one, and then the second one will still just kill you. So a lot of the time, the Death Ward won't actually stop you from being reduced to 0 hit points, because by the time you're casting 4th level spells, many enemies in the game have damage that's dealt in multiple instances, and the Death Ward simply won't stop that. There is a use case for Death Ward, which is if you are using camp casters, you can cast this on your active party, and then when it's free, you might as well have it. But honestly, I would much prefer to spend my camp caster 4th level spells on freedom of movement, which is going to be a much more relevant defensive buff than a defensive buff that most of the time simply isn't going to function or do anything. It's also worth mentioning that Death Ward is bugged, and you can abuse this bug to get infinite actions if you have a character who can recast Death Ward every turn and knock themselves out every turn, because the way that it works is when the character comes back, it refreshes their action. So you can abuse this bug to get infinite actions, and sometimes you'll see speedrunners and stuff like that using Death Ward for that purpose. But outside of that one abusive buggy case, Death Ward simply has no uses. D tier. Dimension Door. Dimension Door is a teleport spell that targets yourself and one adjacent ally, and teleports the two of you to anywhere that you can see. Actually, it has a maximum range of 167 feet, but in practice, it's anywhere within line of sight, and you can use this to go anywhere in almost any given encounter. The comparison that we obviously have to make for any teleportation spell is how often are you going to want Dimension Door instead of just using Misty Step when you're going to teleport. And there are a couple encounters where the extra distance or the ability to bring someone along matter, but obviously the vast majority of the time, other mobility options are going to be sufficient, and you won't want to use your action in order to move yourself and an ally. Dimension Door is a mobility spell, and mobility is always good, but because it costs your action, you can't use it and then do something else when you arrive. So it severely constrains how useful this is as an actual combat spell. But there are a couple encounters where you need to get across a large field, especially in Act 3. There's a bunch of encounters where they're timed and you just need to traverse an area as quickly as possible, and Dimension Door is very good for that. You can also bring NPC allies with you, so you can use Dimension Door in order to move NPC allies for encounters where it's important that you move them. For those reasons, Dimension Door does have a couple cases in specific encounters where it's good. Mostly, you don't need to have this spell prepared, because if you need to move yourself or a party member, there are much better ways to do that. Simply jumping is often going to be more than sufficient, and for cases where jumping is not sufficient, then Misty Step is going to be plenty, and the extra distance from Dimension Door does not by any means make up for costing a spell slot 2 levels higher and requiring your actual action. But there are a couple encounters where Dimension Door is useful, because traversing an enormous distance is just what you need to do in that encounter, and Dimension Door does that. For that reason, I'm going to give it C tier. It's really only good in, I think, like 3 encounters in the game, but in those encounters, it does do a pretty reasonable job. Dominate Beast. Dominate Beast lets you mind control a beast. So they make a wisdom saving throw, and if they fail, then for 10 turns, an enemy becomes an ally, and that beast will fight for you. Obviously, a wisdom saving throw in order to make the enemies down 1 member and you plus 1 party member for the duration of the encounter is pretty good. The enemy does get an additional wisdom save to break out of the effect every single time they take damage, so you probably won't end up mind controlling them for the entirety of an encounter, because beasts especially tend to have low AC, so they'll likely attack each other and break out of control pretty quickly. But this is a very powerful effect if you can get it to land. The problem with Dominate Beast is simply that there aren't any dangerous fights with beasts in Baldur's Gate 3, at least not by the time you get this spell. Once you're in Act 2, or by the time you're level 7, you've almost certainly fought every major beast fight in the game. So Dominate Beast simply doesn't come up in any encounters where you're likely to struggle between the time when you get it and the end of the game. There is one encounter where it can be okay with the dinosaurs in Act 3, but outside of that, you simply won't get an opportunity to actually cast this spell, and even there, it's only fine, because enemies can break each other out of the control, so it's not clear that it's better than just using any other control spell to actually take them out of the fight permanently. Dominate Beast is a fairly strong effect, but the number of targets that it hits in the game is extremely minimal, and the priority of targets that it hits in the game is extremely minimal, so there simply isn't a reason to prepare and cast this spell. D tier. Evard's Black Tentacles. I still don't know a year later whether this is supposed to be pronounced Evard or Evard, so since I went with Evard in the previous video, I'm going to say Evard this time just to irritate people. Evard's Black Tentacles is a battlefield control spell. It's a 20-foot radius concentration spell that lasts for up to 10 turns, and enemies inside of it have to make a strength saving throw or become smothered. Smothered is the identical condition to Entangled. It prevents enemy movement, you have advantage on attack rolls against them, and they have disadvantage on attack rolls. So it's basically the same save and effect as the level 1 spell Entangle on a level 4 spell. In addition to that, if an enemy is currently being smothered by the tentacles at the beginning of their turn, they have to make another saving throw in order to break out, and if they fail, they stay smothered and then also take 3d6 bludgeoning damage. So each turn they stay stuck in the tentacles, they're going to take 3d6 bludgeoning damage, not on the initial cast when they first save against the spell, but every turn thereafter they'll take a little bit of damage. Adding a little damage to a level 1 spell does not make it worth a 4th level spell slot, but there are some real advantages that Evard's Black Tentacles has over Entangle or Web, which are lower level versions of the same effect, that are worth mentioning. Firstly, it's a bigger radius, which matters a lot. Entangle is only a 10-foot radius, Web is a 13-foot radius, and Evard's Black Tentacles is a 20-foot radius. So you're much more likely to be able to catch more of an encounter in this spell than you are with the lower level versions. And it's not flammable. Entangle and Web are both flammable, which in Baldur's Gate 3 matters a lot. There's lots of incidental fire damage, lots of environmental hazards that can just randomly set your control spells on fire. And you can't layer something like Wall of Fire on top of Entangle or Web. You can with Evard's Black Tentacles. So the question is, are the benefits that this spell has over its lower level versions worth casting it? Extra radius, not being flammable, doing a little bit of damage every turn, is that worth spending a 4th level spell slot over a 1st or 2nd level spell slot? Usually the answer is going to be no. Entangle is already an effect that's only useful in some encounters and against certain types of enemies, so it's already a fairly situational effect, and spending a lot more important of a resource on it is a really big cost increase compared to the lower level versions. So usually if you want this effect, you're going to be happy just casting Web and not worrying about Evard's Black Tentacles. There are 2 cases where it can be good to cast this spell though. One is if you want to combine it with a fire effect. Mostly that's going to be Wall of Fire, and that is a pretty powerful way to lock down enemies and keep them locked in the Wall of Fire. There's other ways to do that, of course, but Black Tentacles is a good way to do it. 2 4th level spell slots is pretty expensive, and the concentration from 2 of your casters, but it will kill most enemies who are caught in the combination there pretty quickly, so that can win some encounters if you want to spend the spells on it. And the other reason to cast this spell is if you're a Warlock. This is available to Wizards, who usually don't want to waste a 4th level spell slot on something they can get from a 2nd level spell slot. But Warlocks don't care what level their spells are, they only care about the effects of the spell. And so for Great Old One Warlocks who get Evard's Black Tentacles, it actually is a pretty powerful spell since they don't pay any premium in order to get the powered up version of these lower level spells. On a side note, this is one of the spells where the Baldur's Gate 3 implementation annoys me the most, because in tabletop, Evard's Black Tentacles is an extremely powerful disable spell because in order to break out of the restraining effect, characters have to spend their action just to try to make a saving throw to get out of it. In Baldur's Gate 3, they just get a save at the beginning of every one of their turns, so they're going to break out of it pretty consistently, which turns it from an extremely powerful and really interesting spell into a control spell that simply doesn't control enemies as well as other control spells and is less consistent. Also targets a worse saving throw in the form of strength, because a lot of the enemies you would want to restrain are going to have good strength saves. So Evard's Black Tentacles still useful for Great Old One Warlocks, and with the combination with Wall of Fire, it's still castable. I personally have kind of a grudge against this spell because it's so much cooler in tabletop than it is in Baldur's Gate 3. I'm going to give it B tier for Great Old One Warlocks, C tier for Wizards for the combination with fire effects, but mostly if you want this effect, it's available at level 1, so don't spend a level 4 spell slot on it. Fire Shield. Fire Shield is a 10-turn non-concentration buff spell. Takes your action to cast, but since it lasts for 10 turns, you can usually cast it before combat starts and not actually spend an action on it. And it comes in 2 modes. You can either cast this for Fire Shield Cold or Fire Shield Warm. If you use the Warm version, then you gain resistance to cold damage, so only half of all cold damage will be dealt to you, and anytime an enemy hits you in melee, they're going to take 2d8 fire damage in return. If you use Fire Shield Cold, you gain resistance to fire damage, and the retaliation damage is cold damage, which is usually going to be the more useful of the 2 modes because fire damage is more common in Baldur's Gate, so resistance to fire is going to come up in more encounters, and doing cold retaliation damage probably synergizes with other retaliation damage effects, most notably Armor of Agathis, so Fire Shield Cold can be pretty useful for a character that's trying to stack retaliation effects with Armor of Agathis and additional cold damage alongside the wet effect to do a bunch of damage in return. The tooltip for this spell is going to show that it does both types of damage, so it actually shows more damage than the spell does, unfortunately, which can be a little misleading to players, but you only get either the 2d8 fire or cold damage when you cast this spell, since you choose one of the 2 modes. This is a spell that can be useful in some encounters if the damage resistance is relevant. Spending a 4th level spell slot on that is not a tremendously useful exchange, but obviously taking half damage for the main damage type in a given encounter can be pretty powerful. And there are some encounters where there's a lot of melee enemies that do a specific kind of damage, and so having retaliation damage against them and resistance against their main damage type can be pretty powerful if you have a character that you know is going to be taking a lot of hits. The main problem with Fire Shield is that enemies do actually care about retaliation damage and how much damage they're going to do to you when they calculate who to attack. So often the upshot of casting Fire Shield on an ally is simply going to be that the enemies choose to attack somebody else. So unless you're able to get damage resistances or really high AC on your entire party, Fire Shield will more often end up redirecting aggro than actually causing your characters to take half damage and do the retaliation damage in return. There are some specific builds that can get good usage out of Fire Shield. Abjuration Wizards are sort of the natural pick, where the retaliation damage is part of your plan and you don't mind taking hits. Barbarians can also get pretty good use out of this. They naturally have resistance to bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing, but giving them cold or fire resistance can make them much harder to kill with one of the main damage types in an encounter, and Barbarians are likely to take a lot of hits. They have Reckless Attack to cause enemies to prioritize attacking them, so you can get a decent amount of retaliation damage out of this. But in general, this is going to be a very expensive spell slot. 4th level spell slots are really valuable for just a damage resistance for one encounter, which you can get in lots of other ways, whether with the elixirs, passive effects like the Darkfire Shortbow, or from resistance to energy, which just lasts all day. So Fire Shield won't always be useful for the resistances, and the damage retaliation is only on melee attackers and only useful for builds that actually want to get hit, which is a very small subset of builds. And the amount of damage that you do, even with the cold version against wet enemies, is still not that exciting. For effectively 4d8 cold damage will add up pretty quickly, but and so is useful in combination with Armor of Agathis, but by itself it's not that much. So Fire Shield requires some pretty specific circumstances to want to use it. I'm going to give it C tier because there are builds that make use of this, and there's some encounters where it's pretty good. Getting this from an item also is excellent, so that it is a very powerful tool, given the armor that lets you cast it. But for actually casting the spell is just too expensive for the effect most of the time. All right, my friends, we are halfway through the 4th level spells, and surprising nobody, I had a lot to say about each of the first half of these spells, and I will have a lot to say about each of the second half. So rather than do one super long video, I'm going to split this into 2 kind of short videos, just to make sure that it is a little bit easier to consume at a sitting. So we're going to cut the video here and come back with the remainder of the 4th level spells in the next installment. As always, of course, if you think that there is a spell that I have misplaced in this tier list, or especially one that I'm underrating that you think is better than I've listed it here, definitely let me know in the comments. I'm very interested in moving things around based on feedback. And if you compare this again to my previous version of this tier list, it's significantly different. So obviously, we are willing to move spells around. If people have good arguments, make them in the comments below. Of course, if you have enjoyed the video, feel free to leave a comment and hit like. Helps me out a ton with the algorithm, so I appreciate you taking the time to do that. And of course, you can subscribe to my channel for more Baldur's Gate 3 spell tier lists, build guides, and of course, other strategy game analysis. See you next time for part 2. Thanks for watching, friends, and I'll catch you later.